Okay, I'd like to welcome you to the faculty seminar today. My name is Don Flayton, and I'm just a rank and file working class professor in the Department of Soil Science. The faculty has gone to the absolute bottom of the org chart to find somebody to introduce Paul. Nobody wanted to introduce Paul, but since he's my boss, I'd like to introduce him as the best department head I have.
I'll take it.
I was going to say the best department head ever, but Gaze is here. Anyways, he's professor and head of the Department of Soil Science, and he took his Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture and his Master's at the University of Saskatchewan, and he did his PhD in Canberra, right, at the Australian National University, and then prior to coming to the University of Manitoba, about 15, 20 years ago,
Yeah, 18 years ago.
18 years ago. He had several different positions. He was head of the Weather and Crop Surveillance Unit for the Canadian Wheat Board, and he was also working on satellite-based remote sensing applications development with Noetic Research. His research covers a wide range of agrometeorology topics, including modeling weather impacts on crops, assessment of weather-based production risk, and soil moisture modeling and measuring techniques. And today, he's going to talk about Canopy Reflectance for agricultural crop assessment.
Right.
Paul?
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome, and look forward to kind of giving you an overview. This has been interesting putting this presentation together. So I've said here that there's many others, and this is actually going to span back more than 25 years, so I'm not even going to try to list them all, but a few names will come up as I go along here today and talk about this. And it's interesting because, you know, I sit and look at this particular photo of a area that's in plot research, and the scale of that photo, and which was I think taken in 2017, and I compare that to the kind of stuff that I was doing back at the Wheat Board more than 25 years ago. It's a very different scale. Okay, you know, we were working with images that literally covered the entire planet. And you know, so this is long after my time. This was put together. It's a MODIS image that we didn't have available to us at the time, but this is the kind of scale that we worked at. And of course, you know, now we're working at a totally different scale. But the thing is, the basic principles behind all of this for canopy reflectance are the same. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what those principles are, just so that everybody's on the same page. A lot of you will know some of this, and then kind of move you through what we were doing with that, what's been done more recently, and where we hope to go with it, and use it for in the future. So just to get the basics out of the way here, we're talking about reflectance from vegetation. And if we shine solar radiation on vegetation, we get a very unique kind of pattern here, where we don't get very much reflectance at these wavelengths. So this would be violet colors, and then you get over to here into the red part of the spectrum. And we call that photosynthetically active radiation because that's where we have energy that's absorbed by the plants for photosynthesis. And that's also the wavelengths that we see with our eyes. And then right just at the slightly longer wavelengths, we get this sudden change, and we get fairly high reflection when we get into the near infrared. And that unique characteristic is basically what we're exploiting with all the things, all the various sorts of applications we're talking about. You get this change that's different than any other type of surface that we have on Earth, okay, where we have the reflectance pattern tends to be more uniform across these different wavelengths than it does for vegetation. So that basic principle is what underlies all of this. And not only do we see that pattern, but it also turns out that it's quantitative. So if we look at, you know, corn or soybean, and again we look at these wavelengths, now reported in nanometers, just to make sure things are confusing here, but it's the same wavelengths, and you see this pattern where you've got low reflectance at these wavelengths, and then you get this sharp boundary, and then you get high reflectance in the near infrared. Then you get a low leaf area index and progressively denser canopy. That NIR reflectance becomes stronger, and there's greater absorption happening here as well. Also, a few things happening out further out at longer wavelengths that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But most of what we're going to concentrate on is just this simple difference right there, and that's what we're exploiting. So what we do with this is that if we can get a reading of the reflectance that we would see, for example, in the red part of the spectrum, compare that to the near infrared. Well, this is what's used to calculate what most people are used to. It's called a normalized difference vegetation index, and it's this difference. You know, what are you seeing reflected in the near infrared minus what's being reflected in the red? And the bigger that difference, the more robust your canopy and the more vegetation in that you would expect. Now, notice that this is normalized, okay? So because it's a normalized, the reason for doing this is that the origins for a lot of this work was with satellites as platforms, and these satellites that were being used to make these measurements on the Earth's surface were in a near polar sun synchronous orbit, which is just basically means that the satellite passes over same time of day every day, and it has the sun as its radiation source, and it's measuring what's coming back off the surface. And depending on, you know, if you've got a satellite with a really wide field of view like this, okay, this radiation that's bouncing off at the edge of the image is passing through a lot more atmosphere than that's directly underneath the sensor. And that atmosphere is scattering and absorbing that radiation. So by normalizing, you're trying to make these pixels in your image out on the edge more comparable to the ones underneath. So that was part of the reason behind normalizing a lot of these vegetation indices in the first place. So if we look at some of the satellites, one of the first ones that was used to a large extent, and this is a weather satellite. This is not for vegetation monitoring, but it was in polar orbit for NOAA for weather purposes, and it had a band that would give you a red reflectance and another one that would give you a near infrared, and you could use that to monitor vegetation. Had a few headaches with that when we were using it at the wheat board because it's not a calibrated sensor. It drifts. Okay, it was never designed to be quantitative, so there was a whole bunch of things you had to try and deal with, but nonetheless, you could make it work, and you could calculate an NDVI from that satellite because it gave you those two bands. What was good about this one was you got a picture of the whole world every day. Gave you an image, very coarse resolution, okay? Kilometer, if you could get a 1 kilometer resolution, that's the best you could get, okay? But you got the whole world every day. And that meant you could stack up 7 or 10 images and use that to make a composite image and try to get rid of the cloudy pixels and stuff. Because in these wavelengths, there's a cloud in the way. What the satellite sees is the top of the cloud. It does not see the surface. And that's the big downfall for these. So you get, this is Landsat 7. So it has more wavelengths that it measures. There's these 4 that I'm showing plus 3 more that are out into the thermal infrared. But again, there's that red and near infrared wavelengths that you can use here to calculate the NDVI. And the problem with the Landsat was you get a look once every 16 days. If it's cloudy, come back 2 weeks later. That's when you get your next look. So a much higher resolution than you could get with NOAA, but you don't get it as often. So they all have their own particular strengths and weaknesses. And of course, since then, there has been, I don't know how they organize the parking and the freeway in space, because the number of satellites that are up there, and some of them are actually chasing each other around so that the image right behind each other, it's just incredible. I guess there's a lot of room up there, but, and I'm certainly not as up on the latest satellites as I once was. But one I want to mention here, this MODIS, which is Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectrometer. And you can see it's measuring a whole number of different wavelengths. It's spectrally much more diverse than the other ones that I showed you. Higher resolution than NOAA and more frequent coverage than Landsat. So it's become quite an important sensor that we're going to talk about here a little bit more in a minute. So what I'm not going to talk about is developing new vegetation indices. Vegetation indices are, like, there is dozens and dozens of them, and we've known about them for decades, okay? A lot of them are, like here's the NDVI that I was just showing you, a red and a near-infrared channel, how you would calculate it. Some use the green instead of the red. Most of these, or all of these ones, are all normalized, and that would be because they're trying to be adapted for use on a satellite that is picking up a certain wavelength that you can use to characterize the vegetation. So we've got lots of them, and this has nothing to do with trying to develop the latest and greatest and best vegetation index. None of these have come out at the top. NDVI is still probably by far the one most commonly used, even though other ones have been utilized in other research. They're not all normalized. Some, like these are ratio indices. Okay, so a simple ratio here would just take those same NIR and red channels and just put one over top of the other, like a ratio as opposed to a difference. So there's different types of ratios that have been proposed and used and assessed in the past. Okay, well, let's jump ahead here a little bit and just take a piece out of some of the stuff that has happened since I've come to the university. So one of the things that did happen was the MODIS satellite did become, the first sensors became operational in the year 2000. And I don't know, somewhere around, not quite 10 years ago, I met Manasseh. He comes from the southern part of Africa, and he had the same background as me, looking at large areas and using this in a regional sense to come up with yield estimates, production estimates for large areas. And so with our colleagues at the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, we got a bunch of MODIS data, some of the first MODIS data that was available for Canada, about 7 years worth, and we did an assessment on that. We took almost the same approach as we had done close to 20 years earlier at the wheat board. We took the images for the prairie region, we split them up into these different climatic regions, and then what you do is you oops, come back here, there we go, and you overlay something like these census agricultural regions, strip out everything that's river valley and cities and anything that's not cropped, so that you get a mean NDVI value for each one of these different census ag regions. And we group them together and look for relationships between the crop yields that are reported in those census regions versus what we're seeing with the MODIS satellite. And we were using NDVI. So the MODIS satellite with a resolution of 250 meters, that means that at any one pixel, there's no guarantee you're looking at one crop. Most of them are mixed. They're multiple crops, okay? But despite the fact that they are multiple crops, Manasseh and I both had the same experience, you can still use that to come up with relationships to yield. I mean, it's messy, yeah, but this is the kind of thing that you can find. You tend to have differences between the climatic regions. Some of that, I think, is related to, especially in the drier parts of Western Canada, you get more fallow and bare soil, and I think that has an impact on what you get for these indices. But you can develop these relationships. I don't know, this I guess was timely. This is in the Web of Science, one of the top citations in that area. Okay, so I think people were anxious to know if this works, and you will find MODIS imagery is used in the crop condition assessment program. If you go to the Ag Canada website and look for crop condition assessment, that's a joint effort between Statistics Canada and Ag Canada, MODIS is now used there. It's as well as the NOAA imagery that was in there originally. So. Now this is a slide that came directly from a presentation I made standing right where I'm standing right now, almost 18 years ago. So I came fresh minted from industry, okay, worked for Noetics Research, and the difference between what I was doing at the wheat board and what I was doing with Noetics was trying to scale this down to a field scale. And that was the whole goal of this. So, you know, come here, I was all hepped up on, man, what can we see at individual fields? So I was giving a presentation about what we can do with this type of data and information. So this is one of the examples I was showing. This is an NDVI image. That's all it is, just from high to low density. It was made with the Landsat satellite, and this was actually an area near Indian Head, Saskatchewan, where they had a field that was laid out to do precision agriculture research. So we were very excited about this and the fact that we could map these differences out. And of course, like Farmer's Edge, there's lots of companies out there that are doing this very thing to map variability across individual fields. And we were interested in saying, you know, can we relate what we see with the satellite here? This is a different satellite. This is the IRS-1D satellite. But what do you see with that satellite in July versus what was harvested from these particular fields later in the season, and draw those relationships and develop those into meaningful, turn the NDVI into something meaningful. This is a different location. This is a different part of Saskatchewan, and I just put it in here as an illustration. Just, you know, this is from Landsat, single Landsat 7 images over that location, a number of different fields with farmer reported yields, and just to see that, yeah, you can get some kind of a messy, but there is a relationship there that holds at the field scale just as well as it holds across broader regions. So in this case, these are individual fields. These are individual crops and individual reported yields that are part of it. So, of course, the world keeps advancing, all right? We still have lots of satellites taking pictures. Yeah, you got to be a little careful what you're doing outside. You never know who's watching. There's so many things staring at you, you got to be careful. But we don't have to rely on those. We have other instruments that have come along, okay? Now we can get up close and personal with the vegetation that we want to monitor. Like we can go out, we can clip a SPAD meter right onto the vegetation, or we can have a handheld or a equipment mounted. These meters are just right there, right on top of the crop. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one. This one's mounted on a drone over in the next building, but in all cases, we're not dealing anymore with a sensor that's somewhere up above the atmosphere. It's right there, close by, and that puts us into a little bit different situation. Now I'll split these into two broad groups. We have these sensors that I'm showing you here would be classed as what would be called active sensors. They have their own light source, so they are not reliant on having sunlight. Theoretically, these sensors could be taken out in the middle of the night and utilized. They send out their own light source and measure what's reflected back in the case of these, or what's transmitted through the leaf material here. But they're all working on that same principle, okay? They're looking at those differences in all cases between red and near infrared light. That part of it has not changed. What's interesting, if you look at, for example, this green seeker, okay, it will give you an NDVI. All right, so that's great. But you remember what I was saying about NDVI? It's a normalized vegetation index, trying to take into account all this atmosphere that you've got between the edges of the image in the middle. That thing doesn't have to worry about it at all. It's got a footprint about 3 feet wide, and that's about it. So there's not much atmosphere to deal with, but yet those same type of approaches are still fairly prevalent, and that's something that we need to think about. So for something like the green seeker, this would be a typical type of application that was originally developed by the folks out of Oklahoma, where you would take a section of the field, make sure you got lots of nitrogen on it. So it's nitrogen rich. Take your green seeker out, get your NDVI reading, and that's supposed to be the typical NDVI of an area that's not short of nitrogen. Then you take that reading, and with your machine, your equipment-mounted green seekers, you drive along, and it looks out in front of you, and it says, okay, where am I seeing an NDVI that's a certain percentage below what this standard should be here? And it gets low enough, it comes to that area of the field, and it adds more nitrogen. Okay? So the theory is fine, right? Because that's a way to top up for a nitrogen deficiency without having to put nitrogen everywhere in the field. So it's a neat way to do that. But remember, it's a single dimension that you're talking about. If this sensor comes up to this part of the field and it says, oh, look at that, that's not as heavy, I'm going to put on more nitrogen. If it's short of nitrogen, fine. However, if that area happens to be maybe saline, or maybe it's got herbicide burn, or maybe it's got a pest, or something else, what's this thing going to do? It's going to give you more nitrogen. Is it going to help? No. And this is going to be a common theme no matter what we're talking about with this at any particular scale. The sensor is pretty reliable at picking up these differences, but it's dumb. It has no clue why the differences are occurring. And that's what's missing in some of the precision agriculture, is stripping down through all the, I would guess, I don't know, I'm sure we could sit here and in the next minute come up with 20 reasons why this area isn't growing as well as everywhere else. This will give you a solution to one of them. Okay? So that's what makes it complicated. Nothing wrong with the technology, it's just the knowledge that's in behind it that's a challenge. So this is some work done with a green seeker. This is in canola. Chris Holzapfel from Indian Head did this as a master's project. And what he was doing, you can see he used NDVI from the green seeker. So we've got a normalized difference vegetation index that's normalized. He divided it by the growing degree days, right? Because what happens if you're back in this field and you're sensing the NDVI, okay, and this is corn at say V3, and then the next field you go to is corn at V6 and further advanced, well, you're going to get a higher NDVI, but it's because the corn's more advanced. So the idea of normalizing the NDVI with growing degree days is to take the more advanced development of the field and the higher biomass into account. Anyway, so you'll see that we'll run into it. INSEY, INSEE. It's an in-season estimate of yield, and that's what he was using here with a couple of different locations and years where he had tested this. So you put down a base rate of nitrogen and you come back in and you would add more based on this INSEE that would tell you whether you were short or not. So what I want to talk about now is an approach that we've been kind of tinkering with now for about a couple of years. And this is a multispectral camera. It's a red edge. It's mounted on a drone, okay? So this is not the drone that it's mounted on. This is a picture of that model. The one that we use looks a little different because it has an extra GPS tower on it. It also has a downwelling radiation sensor on it. There is no extra battery container underneath. Instead, the camera is mounted to the bottom of the drone. It's not on a gimbal. It's mounted solid to that. So this is a passive sensor. So it is very much going to be affected by, is it cloudy or is it not? You do need to be out close to solar noon through a window there to minimize the effects of different types of sun angles. So this is a passive sensor. It is not an active sensor. And we need to bear that in mind. Passive sensors, like the ones on satellites and like this one, have those limitations. Okay? They rely on the sun as an energy source. And what it does is it actually takes 5 images at once. That's what these 5 different filters are for. What it does, it takes a picture in the blue, in the green, in the red, the near infrared, and the reason it's called red edge is because it takes a photograph here, right where you get that change between the low reflectance in the red, and the high reflectance in the near infrared, called the red edge. Okay? So that's what's unique about this one. So what would we do with this? So you go out to an area where you're interested in looking at the canopy reflectance, and basically it's set up, you take the drone up to whatever altitude that you're going to work from. I think we did a lot of our images at either 60 or 80 meters. And it's programmed to go along, and as it's flying along every few seconds, it's taking an image. And then you get to the end and you wrap back and forth, and you need lots of overlap between your images, side to side and front to back. Okay, so it's taking a whole series of these images. The software for doing this is really incredible. You can go and map this out ahead of time into like a map and go, tell it this is the height that I want to fly, this is the overlap that I want. It'll calculate where it needs to fly to do that. And you take your calibration image, you hover the thing, take it over, and away it goes. Just does it robotically. It's unbelievable how well this works. If you want to have fun, you try and freehand it. Then it's a little more challenging. But when you're done, what you end up with is a whole series of these images, okay, for this one location. So the way the drone flies, it's a quadcopter, so it hovers. It want to go forward, it tilts up like this and moves like that. The camera is mounted solid underneath, okay? If the wind's blowing, okay, well then now it has to do this to keep the wind from sliding it around. So every time it moves, it's giving you a slightly different angle underneath it. Each of the images has information on the GPS coordinates and all of those aeronautics that get fed into a program that we've used to process this called Pix4D. So it's quite a sophisticated piece of software that will take all of these images, figure out what part of the field it should be looking at, and literally overlays them. Looks for little benchmarks until it finally ends up with one unified image. Okay? So it puts them all together and stitches them into one image. So it's quite an advanced piece of technology to be able to do all of that. And of course, once you've done, you don't really have a single image, you actually have 5, because you have one for each of the 5 channels that camera has taken the image from. From that, you can then start to calculate all kinds of vegetation indices. So these are, you have the 5 channels plus another 33 different indices that we've looked at initially, okay? And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, we didn't invent any of these. These are all known, right?
Yeah, slight modification on what you want to do.
But these are basically, okay, so we're not inventing new ones here. We're using what's out there and testing them out. We run into processing images. If we have clouds or variable exposure, you get light or dark. And those typical days we get in Western Canada, the popcorn cloud, it's dark and then whoop, then it's light. They're the worst, the absolute worst. Okay, so if you can get clear skies, no wind or little wind, that's what you're looking for, because these cause issues if you otherwise. Matt gave me a quiz one day. Guess where I parked my truck? So context, soil science has these nice white trucks, okay? Get a nice white truck into your field of view. The camera adjusts its exposure just like it's supposed to. Okay, I think I got my truck too close to the plots. So you go back in and you remove every image that has the truck in it, and you get rid of the white truck exposure contamination, and gee, you get a lot nicer image when all that's done. And the next time you park your truck a little further away because it's a pain in the butt. Anyway, so these are things that you learn after doing some of this. Now the reason for having this particular camera and that is because of a project, this SMAP-VEC 16, Soil Moisture Active Passive. That's the first 4 letters. That is a NASA satellite. It is in orbit using microwave radiation to sense soil moisture. That's what it does. VX is a validation experiment. 2016 was the year that it was conducted, and it was done in this area near Carmen and Elm Creek, where we have a very good sharp texture contrast in the soils and a wide range of crops. Turns out that for this particular satellite, the most difficult areas to model soil moisture is right there. They can go anywhere in the world to monitor soil moisture, and they do. I think there's something like 30 different calibration sites around the world. That's the worst one, right there. And I mean, they've given Jarrett Powers and people at Canada a hard time, and they, like, your soil moisture sensors, are they right? And all this kind of, you know, have you calibrated and all this? Yeah, we have. The problem, there's that canopy that a week later is quite different than it was the week before. And it's not like a forest, and it's not like a big native pasture area. It's dynamic. And so eventually we're going to get enough agriculture permeated into NASA for them to understand that this is a dynamic surface. The time we were doing this, the same aircraft that was coming along, we had this area mapped out 50 fields, you know, and we had an aircraft flying, collecting data at the same time the satellite went over top, all that kind of stuff. And then for 2 weeks the aircraft went to Iowa, okay? The second worst location, which is, again, corn, soybean, right? So they're trying to get a handle on this. So vegetation is you have to strip the vegetation layer away to understand what you're getting for retrieval for soil moisture. So that's the challenge. So on each of these fields, the big thing was you got to get a crew out there. I don't know who set this satellite up, but it goes over about 8 o'clock in the morning. And to give a crew time to get out there, they had to be in the field at 6 a.m. to start taking measurements. And you wanted to get them around these points that we had pre-marked in each field, a team of 2 people. We had 10 teams, had to get them in the field by 6 o'clock, measure all those points, okay, and bring them back safely. So it was a little bit of logistics involved with that. On days when the satellite wasn't passing over, well, then we could go back to these sites, and we didn't do them all. We only did 3. We would take a subsample of them and physically sample the vegetation. So we paid farmers for access to these fields and to take these readings. So we had, at the same time, you know, we could fly the drone, and you could get, you know, along these transects, you could collect an image for these fields. Then you take them into ArcGIS. You can process and extract the values around each of the sample points, including the ones that have been sampled for vegetation. The only issue that it worked fine. The logistics of 50 fields was more than we could handle. We could only do a subsample of them. It all boils down to how many days you get to do this, how many batteries it takes to run the drone, all that kind of stuff. But the problem we had was, if you look at these maps, so these are where the air dry, you know, the biomass was sampled in the field, and then these are when the veg indices were captured on a time series. They didn't always line up, and they couldn't, and it's difficult to relate, for example, this biomass measurement here to a satellite or a drone image here, or one that's back here. So it was not an easy thing to do correlations. So that was the challenge that we had with this. However, at the same time that this was happening in 2016, thanks to Dawn and to Amy Mangin, they were out and they were looking at, they had a couple of series of gold level plots, one at Brunkild, one at Carmen, right close by, where they had these nitrogen trial plots for high yielding wheat. And because they were, like, what, 10 minutes you could fly these? I think it was really fast to do. So we collected imagery for these during 2016 and again in 2017. And the difference here is that now you've got a really dense layer of ground data. And that's what was really missing in the SMAP project to try and work with the vegetation, is every one of these plots, okay? You could go into every one of the plots. They had different levels of nitrogen, different treatments. It's been replicated. And this is where Krista comes in, because Krista spent hours and hours, you know, putting all of these nice little polygons around every one of the plots. And inside that, you get several thousand pixels from the drone, and you can get statistics on what that reflectance was. So that's what we used. So based on that, we were able to, I think, make quite a bit more progress. So if I show you these sites, what I did is I took one image from each of the 2 sites for each of the 2 years. and I selected an image kind of, I think they range from July 6th to July 15th. Highest biomass, and say, how does that relate to, in this case, I just used NDVI because it's familiar, but we had all these other indices we looked at too. And when you look at this, this is a fairly typical type of relationship when you have lower levels of biomass. So that's Carmen. If we add the Brunkild 2016 to it, it's similar, but a little bit higher biomass. Go to 2017, it's higher biomass yet. And if we add the Brunkild site to this, now we have this doing what it typically does. NDVI tends to saturate. You get very, very dense canopies, and it doesn't become, it's not sensitive enough anymore. It starts to saturate. So that's one of the downfalls for it. Is there a better index? Okay, that's what we're asking. So yes, you can get a fairly nice linear fit through that. That looks fine. You think, well, wait a minute. Maybe it's non-linear. Yeah, okay, that's a little bit better. I'm always a little bit reluctant to get too non-linear with these things too soon. The bottom line is you've got a limitation at very, very high biomass levels. All right, so let's compare this to an active sensor. This is NDVI with a green seeker on those same plots. That was done at Indices, whereas these ones that I was showing you, those are the same ones with the red edge camera, were taken a little bit later, up to 2 weeks later. And Manasseh and I know that later in the season you tend to have higher correlation coefficients and a nicer relationship. So because this was done earlier, you don't get as tight a relationship. There could be other things going on there as well, but that's one of the differences. So that's to total biomass. What about grain yield? So you have grain yield from this plot. Grain yield is not quite as strong a relationship to either the red edge camera or the green seeker in terms of an NDVI value. We can have all these other indices. I'm just going to show you, this is called the red edge, okay? So instead of NIR minus red, it's NIR minus red edge, okay? That's the only difference. So you get slightly lower values because, of course, red edge is higher than you would get in the red. And you can see it's as good and maybe a little bit better, and also it has less tendency to saturate. So it's indicating that maybe it might work better. If you go and you look at, now this is grain yield, okay? Well, neither one of them does as well as they do for total biomass, and the red edge index isn't quite as good either. So lots of these to try and evaluate. So these are just some examples to kind of show you what you end up with. If we try to summarize this, so the examples were all for Brandon wheat. Amy had both Brandon and Prosper growing at those 4 sites. So if you use both genotypes, both years, so you got 4 site years, all acquisition dates. Every date that we flew the drone, early, late, whenever it was, and we just used the urea plots where there was no late season N being added, something that would perhaps change the reflectance after the drone had already acquired it. This was all urea added at the beginning of the season. What sort of relationships do we find? So these are the top 10, okay? So these are top 10 out of the 33 that we looked at. They all use NIR. NIR is part of all of the indices, but 7 of them use it red edge, 3 of them use green, 3 of them use blue, and only 1 uses red. So interesting. Not the final word here by any means, but it's telling us that there is perhaps room to explore, and I've since come across other indices that may be better than even some of the ones we've tried. So there's more work to be done here to figure this out. So some of the things we tried to figure out. I said the drone has a downwelling radiation sensor, something that's measuring how much incoming radiation is coming in at the same time it's taking the photo. So as you're flying the drone and a cloud goes over, the downwelling radiation sensor should have less energy coming in. Can you correct for that? That's the idea. Can you correct for the amount of radiation? So the sensor that we had in 2016, we get this urgent email, don't use it. There's a problem with it. It'll mess your data up. So we didn't do that. We'll fix it. Well, that took a while. So it's 2017 now. Now, here's the fix. So we finally got the thing out. And I was, oh man, we finally have some corrected images for 2017. But I don't know. It did help a little bit, but it isn't going to make all the difference. So unfortunately, it's a passive sensor, and I was hoping this might do better, but it so far has not. We're not even sure if it's actually doing everything it's supposed to, because it's all pretty much a black box inside Pix4D. So we have to look at that a little more closely. Another interesting thing was in 2017, we tried a different elevation. So everything I showed you was acquired over those plots at 60 meters for the drone. Matt and I had some fun and flew this at 40 meters. That's tough to do, to fly slow enough and with a steady hand, but we tried it. And lo and behold, we got some good images stitched together and everything, but some of the vegetation indices that were kind of mediocre at 60 meters were the best at 40. I have no idea. Okay? There's things that could be happening, you know, with a smaller pixel size, seeing down through the canopy to the bare soil easier than you can with a bigger pixel. Just not sure. So we've got some interesting questions from that as well. All right, so where do we want to go with this? We know that when we have like plots like this where you've laid out different nitrogen treatments, and you can literally see with your eye where the check strips are compared to the ones with the high nitrogen. One of the issues that we've got is that when we're trying to handle crops like this, or for, corn or anything else that has a really high level of nitrogen use, you're talking about huge rates. And it would make much more sense not to try to put all of it down at the same time. Okay, fine. What do you know? You know roughly how much you can measure the nitrate that's present in the soil. You know how much nitrogen you can put on with your application. What we cannot get a handle on is how much the soil is going to contribute in any given year. What is the mineralization of N? And it varies enormously from one field to another, from one year to the next. And we just don't have tools to evaluate it. Okay? Is it possible in the mid-season to get a look at a crop and find out how it's doing in terms of its N sufficiency and come in and mitigate if needed? That's what we'd like to do. So in terms of, those are those same crops that we were showing the imagery and the data for. There's the difference in the estimated mineralized N. It's quite a lot. And for the sites where we didn't have the drone measurements, these are the silver level sites, it's even wider. And John Hurd is finding these kind of numbers for corn as well. That's a lot of N contribution from the soil, and we have no easy way to measure it. Okay? And, perhaps if you're a non-soil scientist, you think, well, come on, just what's the soil organic matter, right? Take the soil organic matter and tell me how much it's going to mineralize. Oh, doesn't work really well. And when we compare that, that's from this last study. And I'm sad to say that, if you go back 55 years to Bob Soper and Ming Wang, who did the same thing, we're getting worse, not better. Okay, so we haven't made any progress whatsoever in terms of how much gets mineralized. We have different methods you could look at, but you don't seem to do much better. The other thing is soil health, right? We are starting to evaluate how robust our microbial community is there. We can take the Solvita test, wet up the soil. You'll get this burst of CO2, and it'll tell you about your microbial population. Surely that will tell us how much N mineralization we have. Oh, I guess not. It'll tell you the more robust your population is, the less nitrogen you'll have. Bottom line is, right now we don't have tools that we can say at the beginning of the season, this is what your soil contribution is going to be. But can we evaluate it mid-season? That's the question. So if you look at something like, so this is the Brandon wheat again, flag leaf nitrogen that Amy measured in each of the plots versus, again, this is the 0 to 200 plots, I believe, and then that's the total nitrogen uptake. So this is indicating to me that there is at least some hope that if you can get a handle on nitrogen content within the plant, that at least there's a chance that you could predict what that total uptake would be towards the end of the season and whether it might need further amount. Doesn't work for everything. Okay, if you try the flag leaf nitrogen related to, say, grain N or protein, for individual sites, you get some of these data looks really good. You put it all together, doesn't look good at all. If you look at grain nitrogen as a total mass per unit area, then that's a different matter. It does a little bit better. Other things we can do. David Lobb has said that we can borrow his $60,000 field spec and go and get some hyperspectral measurements. And we can try that out. 2,000 different wavelengths, anywhere from the ultraviolet right out into the near infrared. And we can now start to look at things that we can't with any of the other sensors. This is a nitrogen index that uses wavelengths beyond anything else that I've shown you. So maybe that'll work. I don't know. We'll see whether we can work with that. Some indication, Dave Franson saying that if you combine the height with your vegetation index, you get slightly better data. It's Franson and that as well, where they're looking, one is corn and one is the sugar beet, and they have the height of the canopy in as well as the actual index. And with the drone, because it's doing all of this kind of thing, you can get a 3D model of height. So is there something there to be gained? Possibly. Don't know yet. And then something that Matt has played around with is actually excluding the non-vegetated areas from the canopy. If you get right up close to some of these plots with the drone images, like you can see the rows. So can we go in and actually exclude some of this non-vegetated area? So this is like taking that plot and lowering it down from the one end and looking at what the average is across that plot. But really, what you need to do is get right into it. This is a corn plot where you can see corn plants are quite large, and it's possible that you could exclude anything that's not vegetated and just analyze the vegetated part. That's a possibility too. Some of these indices, like the soil adjusted veg index, is because soil contaminates your signal, so you want to get rid of it. So is there a way to deal just with the vegetation? All things that are possible, but we don't know where they're going to lead, and they may help us or they may not. So just a quick summary here. You can measure canopy reflectance with a variety of sensors on a variety of platforms, but the measurements from those sensors and platforms, okay, they exhibit varying levels of performance, okay? You try to relate them to a crop, you get variation. And it's difficult, I think, to extrapolate from one to the other. It seems like the most appropriate index that you use depends on the sensor and the platform. If you're looking at the same canopy, you get different answers. Possibly reflectance at longer wavelengths with that hyperspectral instrument, or combining it with something like crop height, or removal of anything that's non-vegetated. All of those things may help us a little bit to understand this better, but I don't know yet. So we're going to try this summer on corn. We're going to go out and get some measurements on a corn trial very similar to the wheat, where you have different levels of nitrogen. We'll see what that does for us. So I need to acknowledge the Canadian Space Agency was kind enough to let me redirect some of this funding towards a drone and a red edge camera. Matt Gervais, Chief Engineer, Chief Drone Operator, Chief Data Cruncher, and his sidekick Krista, who made all of this possible and actually did a lot of the slides here as well. Also to Amy and to Don for sharing the data from those plots with us, and to Mario for making Matt's time available for this particular study. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We've got a few minutes for questions. Any questions from the audience for Paul? Chris.
You said at one point that the correlations got better as the season was later. Do you think that is because at that point the leaf area index for the crops you're working in is such that really there isn't so much soil contamination?
I believe that is part of it, yes, I do. Now, I say that at the same time that a lot of that work, like what I did with Manasseh and Modus and that, was with the NDVI, which tends to saturate. So there's a point where you get enough, and then there's a point where you get too much vegetation. So you're trading off both ends of it, but I think that is part of it, yes.
Other questions for Paul?
For the most part, were you using like the max value compensate when you were aggregating your indices?
For the satellite images, yes. So Modus, those were to cattle. Those were 10 days of images. And yes, they were maximum 10-day values that were used for those. The drone and that up close, of course, is just a single shot. But yes, in the satellites, that's a pretty common thing, except for something like Landsat, because you only get one look. But Modus and NOAA, yes, you can make composites.
You said you use uncalibrated images. For the drone ones, did you ever try to calibrate them?
Oh yeah. So uncalibrated, that was NOAA imagery, because those are weather satellites. They weren't designed for that. Landsat is calibrated. Modus is calibrated. So those satellite sensors and that they are calibrated. The drone, what you use is a calibration palette. You know, you got to get the drone to hover over top and get a photograph of a standard color, and you use that. And when the images are processed, that's part of the input that it uses, is to try and calibrate that. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Is anybody using this in grazing management?
Grazing management. Good question. I'm not sure. They could be. They could be. Yeah.
Milton, Boyd, and Lisa Ford are working on this with forage in Alberta. So
Right. Now, is that satellite based though?
yeah.
Yeah.
And I have, and when it comes to those like broad ones, I would say whether it's for grazing management, I don't know, but that would be more for insurance that you're talking about, right, Michael? But there is, I guess it would depend on the resolution that you require for what you're trying to do. Do you need to see individual fields? That would then dictate what sensor and that you could use.
Any other questions for Paul? No?
What about for food security in terms of predicting caloric or protein, expected protein or caloric yield?
Sure, yeah. I should defer to the expert
Okay.
from Southern Africa. That's specifically what was being done with the system that used, I think originally used NOAA. Does it use Modus now?
Yeah, originally it was NOAA, yes.
Now it uses
That
Modus?
time it was NOAA.
Yeah.
Now it's Modus, yes.
Yeah, but it does.
Modus is the one, the European one. What is it?
Oh, okay. Is that Spot?
Sport, yeah.
Spot.
Sport, because it's the closest. I think.
The French one.
So that's exactly what's being done, is to try and get an early season indication of the yield potential for in this case it'd be mainly corn, I think. It would be the main. Yeah.
Yeah, in most cases in Southern Africa, the major crop is corn. So it will be done mainly for corn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you want to do in any warning system, you want to get a picture of the harvest before harvesting.
Yeah.
So that you can make some contingency measures that, okay, in case there is a deficit, in most cases that's what we're fighting against, then you can order. There are some cases where, I remember when I was there, we had to, some countries they would order wheat from Canada, you know, because
Gives you a
then
chance.
know.
Yeah. Gives you a chance to adjust.
Now, the use can vary. So like in Western Canada, for example, with the NOAA imagery we were using at the time 20 years ago, we figured we could get as much as a 2-month jump before Statistics Canada would have some notion of the size of the crop. The early estimates that we have, there was a margin of error around them, but it would give us about a 2-month jump. In that case, it was nothing about food security. It's all about money. Where can we sell this? And then, oh, meanwhile, can you peek at, have a look at the Algerians and see what their durum crop's like. Oh, they need a lot, so we're going to sell them durum, but we're going to make sure we get a good price for it. So, you know, the purpose that you use it, like you say, can vary. Food security, that was for commercial reasons, and there's a number of different uses for it. But yeah, that's the whole idea, early look. Yeah.
Okay, I think maybe we'll wrap up the formal part of the proceedings, but you can hang around for a few minutes afterwards if people have additional questions. But on behalf of the group here, I'd like to thank you, Paul, for sharing some insights with us this afternoon. And thanks again for the seminar.
All right, thank you.